Today, a deck tech and deep dive in one on Prosper tome-bound. We look at his story and the whole deck that I made for this warlock adventurer bound to his tome. We look at his allies, his art, and we learn why he's so obsessed with treasure as we learn about a fun deck all about casting whatever you find in your adventures while sacrificing them to your demonic overlord. Prosper is one of 4 party members and main characters from the Commander Dungeons & Dragons precons. Each precon featured a member of Zephrys, Frondis and Galea. If you find these characters to be an unlikely team, you're not the only one. While almost nothing is known about them, we'll sketch an opinion about why they're together later. Prosper himself is here, according to Wizards, because he wants to get rich, that's it. But when we read between the lines and learn that Prosper has a Book of Shadows bound to him, together with the fact that he got it from an ancient being, we might learn that Prosper has settled on a deal with the devil that he is now a little too bound by. Maybe he's even bound to his tome. Today we'll learn more about his character, but first let's dive deep into his deck. First, the general strategy. What does Prosper do? He likes to be in parties and likes to claim treasures. Whenever you claim such a treasure as a card from exile, you'd create a treasure token. Almost as if his patron grants him a bit of treasure after sacrificing something to them with their mana. Then, at the beginning of your end step, you exile another card from the top, which you can play until the end of your next turn. Prosper is also just a 1/4 for 2, a black and a red, which is a good defender on its own. In general, we want to create value by casting spells from exile while we gain treasures to cast more spells or do other things like kill our opponents in one time. One important thing to notice is that we do need to cast the cards. So Wildfire Devils, which gives you a copy of a spell, does not work because you don't cast a spell. And Indomitable Creativity does not work for the treasure because you put the cards into play without casting them. So, looking at the deck and our strategies, we have something cool today, which is that someone has put in a card for in the deck and has inspired me to put it in. I think it's a good card and a flavorful one, but let's go over the strategies one by one. So we have a lot of cards in these 2 strategies which are about getting things into exile to cast them later. So these are good because they are card value, but they also ramp you with Prosper tome-bound in play. So we want a lot of effects like this, and it has really become a deck about exiling cards like Etali Primal Storm, which steals from your opponents as well. Of course, we know that example. Then we steal from our opponents with cards like Gonti. I think he is a really good example too. One newer one is Intellect Devourer, which lets your opponents all exile 1 from their hand, which is a very powerful thing, and then you can cast them. Stolen Strategy is a really strong one. I think it's from Strixhaven or something originally. But at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library and then you may cast those. I think that's a really fun way to do it. Wand of Wonder as well, you exile until you get an instant or sorcery, and then you may play them without paying their mana cost, and that might be either 1, 2 or 3 spells according to what you roll, so really a D&D card at heart. Then of course we want to do it with our own decks as well. Discarding cards to get 2 cards from our library is what we want. We want those random cards out of our library. Chandra, for example, is I think a really cool one. Exile the top card of your library, you may play it this turn, so that's 1 extra card that we can play out of exile every turn. So that's a good one, a good example. We have some. By the way, Hidetsugu is not as expensive as you think. I thought it would be really expensive with how expensive the alternate versions were. But it's 1 card that for 3 mana you can keep exiling the top of your library, so that is one thing. Then also when you exile a non-land card this way, they deal damage equal to the exiled card's mana value, so that's a little bit extra on that. I think a 4 mana 4/4 is not bad either. Kami of Celebration is a cool one I found. Whenever a modified creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library, you may play that card this turn. And you might think, well, we don't really have that many modified creatures, but we can put +1 counters on creature with this, which is I think already a good effect. Whenever you cast a spell from exile, put a +1 counter on target creature you control, so you definitely will have some modified creatures in this deck, and otherwise it will just strengthen you. Some classic ones light up the stage, of course, with Spectacle, which lets you deal a damage first to your opponents. But then for 1 mana only, you get to exile the top 2 cards of your library. So that's a strong one. I think this is a fun one. Omen Machines. Players can draw cards, which we don't really want to do, but at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player exiles the top card of his or her library. So that's exactly what we want to do. We don't want to draw cards, but with Omen Machine out, we will be the only person to be able to essentially draw cards or chaos draw these cards. So that is a really strong effect, not because of the fact that we will exile another card off the top of our library. No, because of the first class players can't draw cards. So if you have some other effects that do that, definitely play them. Theater of Horrors also wants us to damage our opponents first, but this one is really underrated. Why? Because at the beginning of your upkeep, you always exile the top card of your library. So even if you get a turn where you don't get to deal with damage, you still rack up those cards. And then you get to play them eventually. So that is strong. You get to play them eventually because for 4 mana you can always deal 1 damage to your opponent and activate this ability. So that's really good. We found a home for Urabrask as well. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. You may play it this turn, and also your opponents get to do that. So a little bit of a opponent of the Omen Machine, but I guess this is still such a good effect that we want both of them in our decks. Then from Magnus, I think this is a really cool one because it's an actual tome. When it ends the battlefield, you take the initiative as well, so that's an extra thing. But mostly what we like this for is the 3 mana and then tap this card to exile cards from the top of our library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. So it's random, but our average mana value is over 3. Anyways, we have some logical interaction here, or I think they are logical, or often played at least, but Reckless Endeavor is a little bit new for you probably. Roll 2d12 and choose 1 result. Reckless Endeavor deals damage equal to that result to each creature, so you get to choose out of 2 numbers, and that's the amount of damage that you will deal to each creature. I think that's a really strong effect. But then, as a transition point into our next theme, you get to create a number of treasure equal to the other result, so 1 to 12 treasure that you get to create. And why do we want treasure? Well, we want a lot of damage to finish our opponents off, because, well, we haven't really talked about any ways that we can kill our opponents in. So one way to do that is with X spells that deal damage, like Ribbons, for example, but Black and Red have a lot of those effects. So definitely try to find those to finish the game if you notice that you don't finish the game often enough. And one other one that I really like that I think is undervalued still as well is Nadir's Nightblade, a 3 mana 1/3 elf warrior. Whenever a token leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. That means for every treasure that you sacrifice, they leave the battlefield and each opponent loses a life. That's the most important part. At this point, for example, if we would sacrifice our treasures for a Ribbons from Cut to Ribbons, we would deal 2 damage per treasure and we would only need 20 treasure, which is a lot, to immediately kill our opponents, but over time this will be a lot of damage and we need more cards like these in this deck to be able to kill our opponents as easily as we want. You might say, well, how do we make so many treasure? Well, we need cards like Xorn as well, because treasures are essentially how we will defeat our opponents. If you would create 1 or more of them, you instead create 2 of them in this case, because we keep creating 1. So that means that we get to double this effect, so we only need to cast 10 more spells from exile. Well, that is still a lot, but one easier way to do it is with this more expensive card that is, I think, legit for its price. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you create a treasure, so that helps us. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control only 10 or more treasures, you win the game. You will get targeted from this card, so make sure you will have those 10 treasures ready, I guess. That is really important. Some other things that also work are, for example, foretell, because you foretell them, you exile them, and then you may cast those cards from exile with foretell. The adventure cards also work, so you adventure Murderous Rider by killing a creature or a planeswalker, and then you may play the creature, and when you play the creature you get that treasure. And another way is, I think I have it here, yeah, Cascade, which says when you cast your first spell from exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. So that means we get another treasure for that. So this essentially would cost, for example, 3 mana basically. Then we are sacrificing a lot of cards, and we might want to sacrifice cards from our opponents that we might not necessarily want, so we will do that as well. But whenever we sacrifice permanents, which is important, we don't only want effects that happen with creatures per se. That's why Mayhem Devil is so strong. We do another damage, so that's essentially another Nadir's Nightblade in this deck. I think, yeah, Jury does this as well. When you sacrifice a permanent, it grows stronger and it deals damage when it dies. And of course, this one sacrifice a creature, which we want to do, for example, with Jury, deal a damage to any target as well. As I said, these cards don't really work because they don't. I had put them in, but they don't really cast cards, or they don't cost cards, so those are important things to look at. So that's the whole deck. If you want to look at it, it will be in the description, and if you have any feedback on it, out there it as well, because then I'd have to change my own deck. The artist, Yongye Choi, never does anything without purpose, especially in regards to facial expressions. With Prosper, we see a sort of pained expression as he casts his spell from his tome. Seemingly he is gathering a spell about chains, or maybe it's just his medium through which he casts a blood-related spell. His chains are rather bloody. Still, I feel like he was chained to this tome for a longer time, literally bound to it actually, with a large one strapped to his bracer and another large link to the book's own leather. I don't think Prosper is allowed to let go of this book. But let's look into this further, because I assume it will be interesting for our story. Prosper is a warlock. These are mages who often have made deals with demonic patrons, which allows them to cast their fiendish magic. They are often defined by a pact, so it might seem weird that Prosper only cares about treasure, but that just means that he's probably made a deal about sharing his booty with his demon. His book is probably just the medium through which he talks with his patron. That points us towards how Prosper can conjure chains as well. Perhaps because warlocks can use a spell that would create a restraint to hold a creature down within range. It has a version that actually uses heavy chains as well, so I assume that this is what we're seeing right here. It also means that Prosper is at least a level 17 warlock. At level 3, warlocks choose between 3 types of pacts. The Pact of the Chain, which binds their familiar impish creature further to them, Pact of the Blade, which grants them a weapon, and Pact of the Tome, which Prosper has chosen. This makes their patron give them a Book of Shadows, which allows them to choose 3 cantrips from any spell list. Cantrips are never as powerful as a huge chain to bind creatures with. Prosper is friends with his 3 party members: Zephyris, a mage and necromancer that looks for knowledge, Frondris, who's a draconic barbarian searching for glory and fame, and Kalia, a knightly elf who seeks to better the world through laughter and song. These 4 have differing goals, yet they venture together, presumably as strong allies. Kalia, for example, can grant auras to any ally, which seems like an aura of devotion ability, which paladins learn at their 18th level. Together they traveled through the dangerous Sword Coast, where they fought trolls, defeated liches and protected travelers. It's also a place where people value courage, resourcefulness and determination. It seems like our friends are great adventurers. And that was it for today. I want to thank you for listening, checking this deck out and watching, and let me know what cards you would add to the deck.